Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro met recently with China's ambassador to his country. Later, he posted on social media that I am happy with our progress in our mutual cooperation with sister China. Sister China. The future of Venezuela, listening to Maduro this week, could hinge on help from big brother Beijing. Maduro says Washington's imperialist aims include overthrowing his government, regime change that could put China's massive investments in Venezuelan oil in jeopardy. Is the oil worth fighting for? Does China view Maduro's Venezuela as part of the global family? If Maduro picks up the phone to ask Xi Jinping to save him from the Americans, will Xi take the call? I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. This is The Day. We begin the day with the deepening standoff between the United States and Venezuela, an oil-rich country backed by America's biggest economic rival, China. After this week's deadly U.S. strike in the Caribbean, an attack that killed 11 people on a boat U.S. President Trump says was carrying illicit drugs from Venezuela, his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, warned the U.S. is going to wage war on what he calls narco-terrorist organizations. In Caracas, the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says imperialism is launching a new attack aimed at regime change. He insists his country will stand firm, but to do that, will China have to step in?
A speedboat in international waters hit by a U.S. airstrike. The Trump administration claims, without providing evidence, that the boat was being used to smuggle drugs. It is the first attack by U.S. forces since their deployment in the Caribbean, just outside Venezuela's territorial waters. The White House says their goal is to combat threats from drug cartels, which the Trump administration claims are being run by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Caracas has responded by deploying troops along the coast and urging millions to join the militia.
In response to maximum military pressure, we have declared maximum readiness for the defense of Venezuela. In the face of maximum pressure, maximum readiness.
Caught in a sudden standoff with the US, Maduro has been keen to emphasize his relationship with other powerful countries. Top of that list is the main US rival, China. Venezuela has become reliant on Chinese support after years of economic mismanagement and US sanctions. But their relationship is not an equal one. With hyperinflation rising and millions of Venezuelans facing food insecurity, the economy is vastly dependent on oil exports. In June and July of this year, over 90% of those were destined for China. But Venezuelan petroleum was estimated to make up only around 5% of China's total oil imports in the same period. Beijing has also lent Maduro's government around $60 billion to help prop up the economy, more than it has lent to the rest of the continent combined. While this makes Venezuela a useful strategic and trade partner for Beijing, it makes China vitally important for Caracas. As tensions with the US rise, Maduro has tried to emphasize his relationship with Xi Jinping, showing off a supposedly unhackable phone gifted to him by the Chinese president. And China has responded to the US deployment in the Caribbean, saying they oppose the use or threat of force in international relations and the interference of external forces in Venezuela's internal affairs under any pretext. But just how China would react to any direct conflict between the US and Venezuela remains, for now, unclear.
And for more on this, I'm joined now by Wesley Alexander-Hill. He's Assistant Director and Lead Analyst for Energy Growth and Security at the International Tax and Investment Center, with a specialty on China and Chinese relations. Wesley, it's good to have you with us. Let's talk about Venezuela and its President Nicolas Maduro. He is hoping that China will come to his rescue if this U.S. standoff escalates even further. What's your view? Will Beijing step in?
I think it is comparatively unlikely. Maybe if we were having this conversation 5 or 10 years ago, when it seemed like Sino-Venezuelan relations were increasing, when China was increasingly interested in Venezuela as a economic partner and as a political project. But the last 5 years, especially post-COVID, have been really disappointing for the Chinese side. China, as part of its loan packages, has basically made many recommendations to Venezuela on how to reform its energy industry, reform its economy, and Venezuela is simply not listening.
You wrote a piece for Forbes, and I'm quoting here, Venezuela may represent an opportunity for China, but on a strategic level, it is a bridge too far. Why?
Because essentially, what does Venezuela offer China? It offers it oil. It offers it actually oil that is pretty difficult to refine and process, but not much else. The Venezuelan model, political model, has a very limited set of appeal inside of South America, even if there was, once upon a time worries about the pink tide. And whatever Venezuela offers, China can get elsewhere, often cheaper, often easier, without confronting the United States of America. If China was thinking about annoying Washington, it certainly could use Venezuela to do that. But the danger in doing that is that China loses the ability to control escalation, to control the tenor of any confrontation between Beijing and Washington, because choices move away from Beijing towards Caracas or towards Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, wouldn't Venezuela be the ideal proxy for China to wage a war of disruption against the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, if China was planning to do that, it should have done something like give Venezuela any military equipment over the last 2 years. All Chinese exports of military equipment to Venezuela have ceased since 2023. Venezuela has a very large, very well-organized opposition, and it is not uncontested domestic political power. So the gamble that Beijing would have to make is that Venezuela either causes enough conventional damage, which is very unlikely, or the United States gets stuck inside of another unwinnable counterinsurgency military quagmire situation, which is also far less likely than other situations such as Iraq or Afghanistan, because there is a large, organized, well-educated opposition to the governing party in Venezuela that we just didn't see elsewhere.
Let me ask you about the oil. China imports around 90% of Venezuelan oil. If that supply is threatened, do you see that changing the equation at all for Beijing?
Not really, because while China does import 90% of Venezuela's oil, that oil is a sum total of Beijing's total imports. It's actually pretty small. The second point is that Venezuelan oil is a very heavy oil, comparatively low quality. So when you compare it with Saudi oil or Iranian oil or many other sources of oil that China has access to in East Africa, for example, you have to spend more money and there's more upfront investment to refine it. For the United States, which actually, even through this wave of sanctions that have been going back and forth for the last 20 years, still refined most of Venezuela's oil because it was economic to do so. China simply, it's not worth expanding its refining capacity just to spend more money to get more oil from this unreliable supplier that is easily intercepted by the United States if really it came push to shove.
Let me ask you about the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. How does Rubio impact what is happening? I mean, he is reportedly the hawk in the Oval Office who wants regime change in Caracas. But there is more to this, isn't there?
There is, because there are very large domestic constituencies in the United States that are very overtly hostile towards the governments of Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. And they actually have pull within the Republican Party and the current MAGA coalition. However, large other portions of the MAGA coalition are not on board for regime change. They don't want to go on any military adventures. So while Marco Rubio maybe on his principles and his heart of hearts hopes that he can institute some sort of regime change, it's not at all obvious that that's actually what's going to happen, because there are huge portions of the MAGA coalition, the Republican Party, that are not on board, even if it's Venezuela, even if it's an actor that has had considerable tension with the United States over the last 20 years. And this is to say nothing about the Democratic Party or people outside of this coalition.
Would U.S. credibility in the region be strengthened if Rubio, if President Trump were demanding democracy in Venezuela instead of focusing on this narco-terrorism war? I mean, and also, is there an end game here for the U.S.?
I don't think there's an end game because American policy has sort of jackknifed between détente, especially after the war in Ukraine began, in the name of lower energy prices with Venezuela, and pressure. The United States and honestly international markets would be better served if a coherent strategy existed, either engagement with Venezuela in the name of lowering energy prices after the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, or consistent pressure in the name of democracy and possibly regime change. What keeps happening is the United States, through the first Trump administration, the Obama administration, the Biden administration, and again in the second Trump administration, tries to do both. So the United States only a few months ago made it legal for Chevron to again do business in Venezuela. Right. And now a month later, we're in an armed standoff with Venezuela with the American Navy off the coast. So every few months, American policy on Venezuela changes, and Venezuela has simply lost all belief that the United States can be dealt with coherently on its end because it doesn't see a through-line policy.
Yeah, a lot of whiplash in Caracas by the sound of it. Wesley Alexander Hill with the International Tax and Investment Center. Wesley, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.